Now that we have reviewed the end of World War I and how that and the economic depression affected the people of Germany between the wars, we'll look at the rise of authoritarianism in both Asia and Europe, starting with Germany. After discussing the rise of authoritarianism and dictators in Germany, Italy, and Spain, we will zoom out, as they say, to get a big picture look at some of the more immediate causes to the start of the war with a Khan Academy video. We'll watch the video together, and I will present an outline during the video for you to take notes. Now we're going to talk about the rise of authoritarianism in Europe, starting with the Nazis and Adolf Hitler in Germany. So in early 1933, Hitler's Nazi party had gained enough seats in government and Hitler was appointed chancellor. Not a month later, there was a huge fire at the Reichstag, which is the German capital where the German government would meet. While it's widely believed that nationalists in the Nazi government were the arsons for the fire, Hitler and the government took this opportunity to blame the fire on communists, and Hitler got the president to issue the Reichstag fire decree, which permitted the regime to arrest and incarcerate political opponents without specific charge, dissolve political organizations, and suppress publications. It also gave the central government the authority to overrule state and local laws and overthrow state and local governments. This decree was a key step in the establishment of the Nazi dictatorship. Germany became a police state in which the citizens enjoyed no guaranteed basic rights, and the SS, the elite Nazi state guard of the police, wielded increasing authority through its control over all the police. So there was a big turning point there with the Reichstag fire. In 1933, Dachau was the first concentration camp established in Germany. So we see the increasing authoritarianism and restrictions starting to come in Germany. In that year, 1933, from April to October, there were more and more anti-Jewish laws beginning to be enacted throughout the country. There was a national boycott of Jewish businesses. Jews were excluded from civil service jobs, that's government jobs, and remember the economic situation that they were in at the time. There were limits on Jewish students in public schools, and then there was a law passed that only Aryans, only good Germans with German blood, were allowed in journalism.
In 1933, in April, Nazi German students decided to organize a nationwide book burning program to eliminate foreign influence, to purify German culture as they saw it.
So you have committees of students meeting with professors together, deciding what categories of books in these university libraries would count as un-German. They didn't see themselves as suppressing culture. They saw themselves as advancing Aryan German culture.
I remember very distinctly a conversation between my parents and some friends who were all shocked that a nation like the Germans, an educated, highly intelligent nation, would burn books. Books never hurt anybody.
The event that the students planned occurred on May 10th, 1933. In each German university city, 34 of them in all, thousands of people gathered together at a public place in which books that had been confiscated either by the students themselves or by Nazi party officials, often with the help of police, were brought and dumped in a pile student leaders exhorted their followers and the listening crowds to swear an oath by the fire to destroy and combat subversive and un-German literature.
For the national treason against our soldiers in World War I, we're burning Hemingway's books.
Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister himself, spoke at the book burning in Berlin.
In June of 1934, there was the Rom affair. So as the country was becoming more and more in the grips of the Nazis, there were still some Germans in the government and in the military who didn't fully support Hitler and his little band of, I say little, his band of supporters. So there was a faction of Germans who were against Hitler at this time. In June of 1934, we had the Röhm affair. So, pressured by German army commanders, Hitler's allies in the army, Hitler directs the SS to murder the SA chief of staff, Ernst Röhm, and his top commanders. The SS also murders several conservative critics of the Nazi regime, including Hitler's predecessor as Chancellor, General Kurt von Schleicher. At Hitler's request, the German parliament, the Reichstag, declares the killings legal after the fact based on a false accusation that Röhm and his commanders had planned to overthrow the government. So think about that for a second. There were German army commanders who had the president kill military police top leaders, and then after the fact had the government say that it was okay because they were going to overthrow the government. These assassinations, it was actually over 2 nights, June 30th and through July 2nd, so the 30th and July 1st nights, later became known as the Röhm Affair or the Night of the Long Knives in Germany. So the next month, President von Hindenburg dies, and Hitler takes this opportunity to abolish the office of president completely and assume both titles, chancellor and president, actually calling himself now the Führer. Throughout 1935, there was increasing persecution of Jews and really of all minorities throughout Germany. There were many laws that restricted the rights of Jews. Other minorities such as gypsies, homosexuals. There was a ban of Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious organizations. And so basically, by 1935, you have full authoritarian rule in Germany under Hitler.
While Mussolini was forging the first fascist state in Italy, back here in Germany, Hitler was taking notes. Once out of prison, he played on many of the same themes as Mussolini, rousing a disillusioned workforce, reviving a struggling economy, and fixing what was considered a weak government. At first, the boom times of the Roaring Twenties blunted his populist message. But then, the Great Depression hit in 1929. The working masses were angry again, and Hitler's promises gained traction. Fascism was now taking root in Germany.
So Hitler promised jobs to everybody. And of course, people needed jobs. That was exactly what they wanted to hear.
Hitler promised the people everything they wanted. He promised them a bright future. He promised them work. He promised them Lebensraum, living space.
Hitler was a powerful, mesmerizing speaker.
People were taken by Hitler's speech, not so much by the beauty of his arguments, but by his sheer fanaticism, by his anger, by his
rage and his repetitive rhetoric. And people, eyewitness accounts, describe it as a barbaric, primitive effect.
What he was telling people was a disaster, but the performance he delivered was a big artistic show.
He repeated a lie endlessly, and he didn't make it a small lie, he made it a big lie, and he kept hammering it into their heads. He also dumbed it down as much as possible.
His simplistic promises were made to order for his political base. More prosperity and expanded borders for more room in which to live, or Lebensraum.
Fascism is perceived as a strong movement with simple answers for complicated problems.
Giving simple answers and simple solutions, that's exactly what people wanted to hear, because that gave them the hope that it will change soon, not in 10 years, but now.
He blamed Germany's problems on scapegoats like Jews and communists. Fears that the communist revolution in Russia would spread to Germany. People were singing Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Germany, Germany above all the world. And they trusted Hitler to take them there.
As things are escalating in Germany, authoritarianism is also on the rise in other places in Europe. In Italy, we have Benito Mussolini. He was called Il Duce, which means the leader, and he was known as the creator of fascism. He emphasized loyalty and obedience to the state and its leader, to him. He promised to solve Italy's economic problems. Most of Europe at this point, along with the rest of the world, was in an economic depression also. His supporters were called black shirts, and that was his army officers. They were wealthy landowners. Industrialists were supporters of his. Basically, the ruling class, the more wealthy business people in Italy, were his supporters. He and his supporters used violence and intimidation to gain support from regular people. In 1935, after gaining power and growing the army, he seized Ethiopia. So you can see he was not the only dictator in Europe looking to expand. The League of Nations objected to this, but they took no action because they kind of felt like they couldn't. Okay, so Mussolini was a charismatic figure in Italy, and we're going to watch this short clip so you can kind of see him in action.
Mussolini capitalized on a deep-seated frustration among Italians. Italy was still a young nation, having only united in 1871. The surge of nationalism that came with unification left Italians hungry for greatness, but feeling disappointed. Its parliamentary democracy was weak and ineffectual, and the economy was terrible. And, as with Germany, the Italians had just suffered through World War I, and people were angry about the way it was fought and the way it was finished. Piazza Venezia became the stage for a new amped-up kind of nationalism. Mussolini loved big rallies, and from his balcony, offering big promises and simple solutions to complex problems, he whipped his followers into a mass frenzy. È già stata consegnata agli ambasciatori. They interrupted his speeches with chants of Duce, 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 leader.
What I understand now is that it was like a collective dream. It was like hypnosis. Standing in a crowd with thousands of people all focused on one man who was terrific at using his body, his facial expressions and language to reach their hearts.
They were going ballistic, even for a hand gesture or a facial expression of Mussolini. Mussolini was an actor, and when he eventually showed up in that window, and he stood in his typical posture with his imposing chin, For the Italians, he was the personification of a greater Italy.
He promised an Italy that would be great, that would be modern, that would be finally unified, where there would be work for everybody.
Now we look at Spain and Francisco Franco. Unlike Hitler and Mussolini, Franco didn't win over the people, their hearts and minds and all that, but rather won power through a civil war in Spain. Francisco Franco was a general in the Spanish army and led the rebellion against the government. The army was supported by the fascists in both Italy and Germany during the Spanish Civil War. The former government's fighters were not professional. The standing army was fighting against the government, and the government was bringing in international volunteer fighters, including communists and anarchists. So they were a lot less organized and a lot less well supplied. They were not well supplied. In 1939, the military was successful and Franco became the fascist dictator in Spain. Escalation in Germany continues, especially now as Germany seeks to expand borders. In March of 1938, the German Nazi government convinces the Austrian government, under pressure, of course, to unify with the Germans because their German-speaking and German ancestry connects them, in the eyes of Hitler, as the superior race. Okay, and so while Germany didn't have to invade or conquer Austria, it was called the Anschluss, where they unified, quote unquote, peacefully. In September of 1938, Germany, Italy, Great Britain, and France signed the Munich Agreement, by which Czechoslovakia must surrender its border regions and defense, the so-called Sudeten region, to Nazi Germany. German troops occupy these regions in October of 1938. Hitler had threatened to unleash a European war unless the Sudetenland, a border area of Czechoslovakia containing the ethnic German majority, was surrendered to Germany. The leaders of Britain, France, and Italy agreed to the German annexation of the Sudetenland in exchange for a pledge of peace from Hitler. Czechoslovakia was not invited to the negotiations, but agreed under pressure from Britain and France. In October of 1938, German Jews' passports were declared invalid, making it harder for them to escape persecution in the country. In November of that year, in 1938, there was Kristallnacht, which, as you may know, was Kristallnacht, that word, is the German word for the night of broken glass. Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were vandalized, ransacked, and tagged, meaning they were tagged as Jewish-owned businesses or Jewish homes. And Jews were also rounded up for camps in the days following.
How did I become aware of Kristallnacht, or that something had happened? Well, this is not the era of television, radio, etc., etc. And as every other morning, I got ready to go to school, and the school was not all that far from our home. And I guess I had just sort of gained that little bit of independence of being allowed to go to school on my own rather than to be taken every day by my mother. I walked by our synagogue. Hordes of people were standing in front of it and throwing stones through the beautiful stained glass windows. I think that they had gone into the synagogue and ransacked it on the inside. They threw Torah scrolls into the streets. And as soon as I got into the school, teacher sat us down and she said, something terrible has happened overnight. And your parents have been alerted to this, and they will come to pick you up. My mother came very shortly after we came to school, and she took me to my grandmother's home. My grandmother lived on the Grindelallee, which was closer to the school than Parkerley, where we lived. And my father was there already, and my grandfather, as I had said before, had passed away. So it was only one of my aunts who was still in Germany, and that's to say an unmarried sister of my mother, and my grandmother, and she had a very large apartment. And my father was there, and so were two other gentlemen. One was a friend of my aunt and uncle, a dentist, and the other gentleman, I don't know, he was a friend of the family. And the reason I said she had a very large apartment, it really ran from one side of the house to the next, and the bedrooms were in the back. And these three gentlemen were staying in that bedroom all the way in the back. We didn't quite know what was happening. My father always was a very courageous man, and you weren't going to tell him that he cannot walk on the streets of Germany. And he went downtown, and I remember him coming back quite shaken up. We went home. We did not make light in the apartment, and we went to bed immediately. And in the middle of the night, they came pounding on the front door. I remember that. And the fear that this instills in a child is a feeling of fear that never in your life can you forget. That feeling of fear is always there. And evidently, now we never came to know this for sure. A next door neighbor opened her door finally and said, "Why are you making so much noise? People are sleeping." And they said, "Well, we want these Jews," and so on. She said, "They're not home." So they left. Now, did she know we were home and she really didn't want us to be arrested and taken away? Or did she really think we weren't home and so on? We never found that out. But certainly her remark saved us from that. And then we went to my grandmother's house and stayed there for the remainder of the week, which was how long that program lasted.
World War II was the largest conflict in all of human history, the largest and bloodiest conflict. And so you can imagine it is quite complex. My goal in this video is to start giving us a survey, an overview of the war, and I won't even be able to cover it all in this video. It's really just to think about how did things get started, or what happened in the lead up. And to start, I'm actually going to focus on Asia and the Pacific, which probably doesn't get enough attention when we look at things from a Western point of view. But if we go back even into the early 1900s, Japan is becoming more and more militaristic, more and more nationalistic. In the early 1900s, it had already occupied Korea as of 1910. And in 1931, it invades Manchuria. So this right over here, this is in 1931. And it installs a puppet state, the puppet state of Manchukuo. And when we call something a puppet state, it means that there's a government there, and they kind of pretend to be in charge, but they're really controlled like a puppet by someone else. And in this case, it is the Empire of Japan. And we need to remember what is happening in China in the 1930s. China is embroiled in a civil war. So there is a civil war going on in China, and that civil war is between the nationalists, the Kuomintang, and the communists versus the communists. The communists led by Mao Zedong, the Kuomintang led by General Chiang Kai-shek. And so they're in the midst of the civil war, and so you can imagine Imperial Japan is taking advantage of this to take more and more control over parts of China. And that continues through the 30s until we get to 1937.
And in 1937, the Japanese used some pretexts with, kind of a false flag, well, I won't go into the depths of what started it, kind of this Marco Polo Bridge incident, but it uses that as justifications to kind of have an all-out war with China. So in 1937, you have all-out war, and this is often referred to as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Sino-Japanese War. Many historians actually would even consider this the beginning of World War II, while some of them say, okay, this is the beginning of the Asian theater of World War II, of the all-out war between Japan and China, but it isn't until Germany invades Poland in 1939 that you truly have the formal beginning, so to speak, of World War II. Regardless of whether you consider this a formal beginning or not, the Second Sino-Japanese War, it's called the Second because there was another Sino-Japanese War in the late 1800s that was called the First Sino-Japanese War. This is incredibly brutal and incredibly bloody, a lot of civilians affected. We could do a whole series of videos just on that. But at this point, it does become all-out war, and this causes the Civil War to take a back seat to fighting off the aggressor of Japan in 1937. So that lays a foundation for what's happening in the Pacific in the run-up to World War II. And let's also remind ourselves what's happening in Europe. As we go through the 1930s, Hitler's Germany, the Nazi Party, is getting more and more militaristic. So this is Nazi Germany, right over here. They're allied with Benito Mussolini's Italy. They're both extremely nationalistic. They both do not like the communists at all. You might remember that in 1938, you have the Anschluss, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, and you also have the takeover of the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. So the Anschluss was the unification with Austria. And then you have the Germans taking over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And this is kind of the famous, the rest of the what will be called the Allied powers kind of say, okay, maybe Hitler's just going to do that. Well, we don't want to start another war. We still all remember World War I. It was really horrible. And so they kind of appease Hitler, and he's able to kind of satisfy his aggression. So in 1938, you have Austria and the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland are taken over by Germany. And then as you go into 1939, in March, they're able to take over all of Czechoslovakia. And once again, the Allies are they're feeling very uncomfortable. They kind of have seen something like this before. They would like to push back, but they still are not feeling good about starting another world war. But so they're hoping that maybe Germany stops there. So let me write this down. So all of Czechoslovakia is taken over by the Germans. This is in March of 1939. And then in August, you have the Germans, and this is really in preparation for what you could guess is about to happen, for the all-out war that's about to happen. The Germans don't want to fight the Soviets right out the gate, as we will see, and as you might know, they do eventually take on the Soviet Union. But in 1939, they get into a pact with the Soviet Union. And so they sign the Ribbentrop pact with the Soviet Union. This is in August, which is essentially mutual non-aggression. Hey, you do what you need to do. We know what we need to do. And they secretly started saying, okay, we're going to, all of these countries out here, we're going to create these spheres of influence where Germany can take control of part of it, and the Soviet Union, and Stalin is in charge of the Soviet Union at this point, can take over other parts of it. And then that leads us to the formal start, where in September, let me write this in a different color. So September of 1939, on September 1st, Germany invades Poland. On September 1st, which is generally considered the beginning of World War II. And then you have the Great Britain and France declares war on Germany. So let me write this: World War II World War II starts. Everyone is declaring war on each other. Germany invades Poland. Great Britain and France declare war on Germany. And you have to remember at this point, Stalin isn't so concerned about Hitler. He's just signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And so in mid-September, Stalin himself invades Poland as well. So they both can kind of carve out their spheres of influence. So you can definitely sense that things are not looking good for the world at this point. You already have Asia in the Second Sino-Japanese War, incredibly bloody war, and now you have kind of a lot of very similar actors that you had in World War I, and they're starting to get into a fairly extensive engagement.